Your grandmother knew something you've forgotten. She could walk into a backyard smaller than most living rooms and see a year's worth of meals hidden in the dirt. Not metaphorically, literally, she could point to a 10 by 10 patch of earth and tell you exactly how many pounds of potatoes it would yield, how many jars of tomatoes it would fill, how many dinners it would cover when winter came and the roads froze over. That knowledge didn't come from books or YouTube videos, it came from necessity. Because there was a time when empty grocery shelves weren't a political crisis or a supply chain disruption. They were just life, and you either learned to feed yourself or you didn't eat. But somewhere between then and now, we forgot how to do the one thing humans have done for 10,000 years. We outsourced survival, and now we're paying for it. The average American family spends nearly $9,000 a year on food that travels 1,500 miles to reach their table. Food grown by strangers, harvested by machines, wrapped in plastic and stamped with expiration dates that assume the trucks will always run on time. But what happens when they don't? What happens when a storm shuts down highways for a week? When fuel prices double and food costs follow? When the global system we've built our entire lives around suddenly reveals how fragile it actually is, most people panic. They rush to the store and fight over the last bag of rice. But there's another option, one that doesn't require panic or luck or hoping the system holds together long enough for you to get through the month. It requires dirt, seeds, and a blueprint that's older than civilization itself. This isn't about becoming a farmer. This is about understanding that your backyard isn't just a lawn. It's a sleeping machine capable of producing thousands of pounds of food every single year. And it's been waiting for you to turn it on. Here's how to feed your family for 12 months using nothing but the ground beneath your feet. The first thing you need to understand is that modern gardening lied to you, not intentionally, but completely, because everything you've been taught about growing food is designed to fail. Wide rows spaced 3 feet apart, shallow soil. Chemical fertilizers that kill more life than they create. Planting everything in May and harvesting in August, and then watching your garden sit empty for 10 months while you go back to the grocery store. That's not gardening. That's a hobby pretending to be self-sufficiency. Real food production doesn't look like neat little rows with plenty of walking space. It looks like chaos organized by intelligence, dense, layered, alive. It looks like a forest floor where every inch of soil is working, where plants grow so close together their leaves touch, where roots dive to feed deep instead of spreading sideways searching for nutrients that aren't there. This is called the deep bed method. And it is the single most important concept you lines ever learn if you actually want to feed yourself instead of just playing in the dirt on weekends. Here's how it works. Instead of planting in long rows with wide paths between them, you build raised beds that are exactly 4 feet wide and as long as you need. 4 feet isn't random. It's the maximum distance you can comfortably reach from either side without stepping on the soil. Which means you can access the entire bed without ever compacting the ground with your footsteps. And that's where everything changes, because soil that never gets walked on stays loose, aerated, alive. Roots don't have to fight their way through hardpan layers. They drop straight down like arrows to feet deep, sometimes more. And when roots go deep, you can plant close, really close. Tomatoes that would normally sit 3 feet apart in a conventional garden can be spaced 18 inches apart in a deep bed. Lettuce at 8 inches, carrots at 2. You're not cramming plants together. You're creating an ecosystem where density becomes strength instead of competition. The leaves form a living canopy that shades out weeds and holds moisture. The roots occupy different depths and don't interfere with each other. And the soil stays so biologically active that earthworms do all the tilling you'd normally do with a rototiller. The math is brutal. A traditional garden might produce 20 pounds of tomatoes from 100 square feet. A deep bed produces 60. Same space. Same sunlight, same water, triple the food. But only if you build the bed correctly. And this is where most people fail. Because building a deep bed isn't just about stacking some lumber and filling it with dirt. It's about creating a root paradise that will feed your family for decades. You start by marking out your 4-foot width. Then you dig, not a little, not casually. You remove the top 12 inches of soil and set it aside. Then you take a fork and break up the subsoil below it for another 12 inches. This is called double digging. And it's the hardest work you'll do in your entire gardening life, but you only do it once. Because once that bed is built, it produces for 20 years without ever being dug again. As you work through the bed section by section, you're mixing massive amounts of compost into both layers. At least a third of the final volume should be organic matter. Not a little compost sprinkled on top, a full third of the entire bed. This is what feeds the soil life, the bacteria, the fungi. The microscopic universe that turns dead leaves into plant food and creates the kind of fertility that no bag of fertilizer can replicate. When you're done, you'll have a bed that's 18 to 24 inches deep, loose as coffee grounds, dark as chocolate. And you'll never step on it again, not once, not ever. You work from the paths on either side. If you need to reach the center, you lay a board across the bed to distribute your weight. But your feet never touch the growing area. Because the moment you step on loose soil, you compress it, you squeeze out the air pockets. You undo the structure that makes deep root growth possible. And without that structure, you're back to conventional gardening with conventional yields. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the bed itself is just infrastructure. The real magic happens when you understand what to plant, and how, and when. Most gardeners plant their entire garden in one weekend in May. They spend 6 hours putting in tomatoes and beans and lettuce and squash all at the same time. They water it, they wait, they harvest for 6 weeks in August. And then the garden sits empty until next May. That's 10 months of wasted soil. 10 months where that bed could be feeding your family, but instead it's just sitting there growing weeds. Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. A garden that only produces for 2 months of the year isn't a food system, it's a decoration. If you actually want to feed yourself, you need to understand succession planting, which means treating your garden like a factory assembly line that never stops running. The concept is simple. Different crops have different maturity times. Radishes take 25 days, lettuce takes 45, bush beans take 55, tomatoes take 80. If you plant radishes today, they'll be ready in less than a month. So if you want radishes every week for the next 6 months, you don't plant them all at once. You plant a small row every 2 weeks. By the time the first row is ready to harvest, the second row is half grown. By the time you pull the second row, the third is coming up. You create a continuous harvest instead of a single glut. The same principle applies to everything. Lettuce every 2 weeks from March through October. Bush beans every 2 weeks from May through August. Carrots every 3 weeks from April through July. You're not planting more. You're planting smarter, staggering the timing so that something is always ready. Something is always growing. Something is always being planted to fill the next gap. But succession planting is just the beginning. Because if you really want to maximize production, you need to understand interplanting. This is where you grow fast crops between slow crops. Lettuce matures in 45 days. Tomatoes take 80, so you transplant tomato seedlings into your bed in April when they're 6 inches tall. And between each tomato plant, you sow lettuce seeds. For the next 6 weeks, the lettuce grows fast and low, while the tomatoes grow slow and tall. By early June, you're harvesting the lettuce. By the time you pull the last of it, the tomato plants are big enough to need that space. You just got to crops from the same square footage with zero competition. The same strategy works everywhere. Radishes between carrots, spinach between pepper plants. Quick growing greens tucked into any gap that won't be needed for another month. You're layering production across time, and every time you do it, you're increasing total yield without adding a single inch of new garden space. Now here's the part most people miss, because succession planting and interplanting are tactics. But they don't mean anything if you're not growing the right crops. And most gardeners aren't. They grow things that taste good but produce almost nothing. Things that take up huge amounts of space and give back tiny harvests. Things that can't be stored and have to be eaten fresh or they rot. If you're trying to feed your family for a year, you can't afford to waste space on low-yield novelty crops. You need calorie-dense staples that produce massive amounts of food and store for months without refrigeration. The backbone of any serious food garden is potatoes. Not because they're exciting, because they're efficient. 100 square feet of potatoes can produce 200 pounds of food. That's enough carbohydrates to feed a family of 4 for 3 months. And they store in a cool, dark place for 6 to 8 months without any processing. No canning, no freezing, no dehydrating. You dig them, you brush off the dirt, you put them in a box in your basement. And they sit there feeding you until spring. Beans come next, both fresh and dry. Bush beans produce protein-rich food from very little space. And if you plant them every 2 weeks from May through July, you'll have fresh beans from June through September. But the real power of beans is in letting some go to seed. Dry beans store forever. Literally in a sealed container in a cool, dry place. They'll last 10 years or more. And they're one of the best sources of plant-based protein you can grow. One 20-foot row of dry beans will give you 15 to 20 pounds of dried beans. That is a year's worth of protein for one person from a space the size of a couch. Winter squash is next. Butternut, acorn, Hubbard, cabica. These are space hogs, yes, but one plant can produce 10 to 15 squash. And each squash stores for 6 months in a cool room. If you have 40 square feet to spare, you can grow enough winter squash to have one every week from October through March. That's 6 months of stored food that required almost zero maintenance after planting. Then there are the crops that produce continuously if you harvest them correctly. Kale, chard, collards. These are called cut-and-come-again crops because you don't pull the whole plant. You take the outer leaves and let the center keep growing. A single planting of kale in April will produce fresh greens every week until November. That's 7 months of harvest from one planting. And in mild climates, it'll keep producing through winter. One 10-foot row of kale can give you 50 pounds of greens over a season. That's 200 servings of the most nutrient-dense vegetable you can grow. Tomatoes are non-negotiable, but not fresh tomatoes for salads. Paste tomatoes for canning, because 30 pounds of fresh tomatoes turns into 15 quarts of tomato sauce. And 15 quarts is enough for one meal a week for 3 months. If you plant 10 paste tomato plants in a deep bed and stake them properly, you'll harvest 200 pounds over the season. That's 100 quarts of sauce. Enough for 2 meals a week for an entire year. Onions and garlic store for months and add flavor to everything. Root vegetables like carrots and beets can be succession planted and stored in a root cellar through winter. But here's what ties it all together. The crops themselves are only half the system. The other half is what happens underground.